Okay.
All right. So I just wanted to give a brief overview before I hand this over to Sunny, who's going to jump into the technical pieces of sort of why, give some orientation for where we are and how we got here. But very, very, very quickly. So CBJ employees and JCOS worked together to work on greenhouse gas emission inventories in 2007 and 2010. And that was great work. And thank you to everybody who participated in that work. And we're lucky to have some of those participants in our meeting today. So that's great. Provides continuity with people like our Assembly Liaison Maria Glashevsky and Steve Benke. So we want to thank you for all of your work and the continuity there. Also, in terms of now, why are we doing this again? Essentially, want to give credit to Steve Benke, who is our JCOS Energy Chair, who essentially brought up the issue at JCOS meetings. So I think it's time to revisit the Juneau greenhouse gas emission inventory. It was good work in 2007 and 2010, but it's been a while. So it's that's relatively standard in communities to revisit their point in time greenhouse gas emission inventories. Now, in terms of, well, why are we working with Dynamics, who was then acquired by Constellation? So some of that background is that there had been some previous attempts by both JCOS and CBJ staff that predate me, that when they were thinking about redoing and updating the greenhouse gas emission inventory, of going back to fuel distributors in town and asking them for information. And that's a really critical information piece when you're doing a greenhouse gas emission inventory. Some of those, so the requests were made to the fuel distributors in town, and the fuel distributors did not provide that information. So as we were, thinking about how we move forward, we knew that we might be in a situation where we don't have as much actual fuel data as we would really like, and there would have to be modeling involved. So that's how we came to work with what was then Dynamics when we first signed the contract, and then was purchased by Constellation, because they knew going into this that they have a model where essentially they could do some of that modeling, they could deal with some of those data gaps. We picked the year 2021 because we know, instead of just doing a 10-year snapshot, would have been 2020. We all know what happened during 2020. So we didn't pick that year. We went to the next year, 2021, and you might say, well, we're in 2023. But I can tell you it's taken us months and months of feeding data into this model. So we've been doing all of this work in 2022. So that's why we're looking at calendar year 2021. And then in terms of, but I do want to stop there and say, we, of course, would be happy to receive fuel distributor information at any time, and that information could be integrated into this model. It's just that the model, we could proceed without actuals. There is a way to sort of estimate. Then in terms of the process here, as Gretchen said, this is, we just wanted to be really, this is an iterative process. We wanted to be transparent. So this is the first view. So we're calling this the preliminary view. We have the presentation materials are in the packet. I sent it, I think, to most people who were on this meeting today, received that email, but I'll also in the chat put the links where you can find all of the information, because it's pretty information dense. And so people will see that information. The next step will be at the next JCOS meeting, which is also a public meeting, just like this one. That is on March 1st. And that's where we'll have, essentially after today's dialogue, we wanted to sort of preview this. We know we have a lot of expertise in the community. We want people to have an opportunity to ask questions, to raise red flags, to bring up issues. And then we'll take that information and feedback from today's meeting. We'll integrate that into a draft report, which will be part of the JCOS March 1st meeting at noon. That will also be on Zoom. And then that will we'll have a short public comment period on that report. It'll probably be about 2 weeks. And then we'll receive all those public comments, and then we'll integrate them, and then we'll finalize the report. But I did want to also mention that that process would be the end of the process for the 2021 greenhouse gas emission inventory. However, in CBJ's contract that we have with Constellation, we do have the option for 1-year renewals. So what that means, that's sort of like the official procurement speak. The plain English means if we like what we got for 2021, CBJ can contract with Constellation, and we could get similar reports for 2022, 2023. And what that would help us to do is to get more of a trend versus these really disparate point in times where we had 2007, 2010, and then a really big gap before 2021. So we have the potential for a little bit more continuity moving into the future. So with that, there's a lot of material to cover. So I want to hand this over to Sunny for the technical presentation. I'm going to ask folks to not ask questions during the presentation. He has a lot of material to cover, and he might answer some of your questions in a next slide. So I in some ways thought about this as if it were a webinar and sort of the standard webinar format, where the presenter will give, we'll let Sunny give his presentation uninterrupted, unless of course like the sound goes off or something, then wave at us. But let him give his presentation. And then I'm going to ask folks to put questions or comments that they have in the chat. And Gretchen and I will be monitoring those comments in the chat as Sunny is giving his presentation. And at the end, Sunny will start taking some of those Q&A questions that people have put in the chat. And then if there's more time after that, then folks can just raise their hand. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sunny.
Wonderful. Thanks, Denise, and hello, everybody. Great to be here. My name is Sunny Sanwar. When we started this process, I was founder and CEO at Dynamics, a software company where we helped local governments measure their greenhouse gas emissions. And very recently, we were acquired by Constellation Energy. A little bit about Constellation Energy, they're a retail energy provider. They have their own renewable fleets, solar, wind, and nuclear, and they generate half of America's nuclear energy, as well as selling power and gas commodities to 3/4 of the Fortune 100. So we're very excited to be part of this journey. We, kind of on the upfront, want to thank everybody on the CBJ side that's been very vital for our data gathering and kind of other processes that we've used, and we're excited to share this with everybody. As Denise said, these are preliminary findings that we're going over today, and after my presentation, would be happy to hear kind of your inputs and comments as they come through. So with that said, I'll jump right in, starting with a quick intro of why we're doing this in 2021 again. So we're using the 2010 Juneau emissions inventory as a stepping point to redo it in 2021, because ongoing greenhouse gas emissions at the community level is really important to understand. Options in which we could probably help mitigate emissions into the future and deal with climate change more broadly. So we gathered energy use data from which we calculated emissions, both for the community and also for CBJ specifically, which we can talk about here in a second. The 2021 update for Juneau has used calendar year 2021 energy consumption across the entire community boundary. We had data provided by actual data provided by entities like AEL&P for power, and also for air travel from the Juneau International Airport. However, as Denise said, there were some other liquid fuels, such as propane, diesel, heating oil, both for stationary and marine transportation, that we didn't have access to. So we estimated them using models that we will discuss here today. So that, just kind of pointing that piece out again, because that will be a recurring thing throughout this presentation, and it's probably pretty important for how we view the greenhouse gas emissions for the 2021 update. The methodology, it's always good to kind of, there's many ways of measuring community-wide outcomes when it comes time for estimating greenhouse gas emissions. The most commonly used inventory standard is the GPC, which is the Global Protocol for the Community-Wide Emissions. And this is maintained and developed by WRI, which is the Research Institute, in partnership with C40. So this is the common methodology and a GHG emissions protocol that is used by most communities here in the US and beyond. We determine the unit that we will talk a lot about here today, which is the metric ton of CO2 equivalent, because that is a combined product of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So all of these emission factors are in fact provided by the protocols themselves. What we're adding for Juneau is how much of different types of energy was consumed in the calendar year 2021. So that's the inventory methodology we've used. There's a lot of sort of write-ups about it if you're interested in kind of understanding details, but that's the protocol of choice. We also made a lot of use for the US EPA and the National Renewable Energy Lab models, both on the building side as well as on industrials and power. We actually received a lot of the EPA flight data for 2021 for the 2 mines and for the landfill from the EPA. And some of the assumptions I'll go through here in a bit. And then finally, on the methodology slide, we want to point out that the emissions are not weather normalized. And what that means is that every year there's different variations in weather patterns that impact the amount and type of energy consumed by different end uses. You can think about, heating, if there's a substantially cold winter or, a hot summer, you use a little bit more fuel to satiate those demands than you would have in a year where the weather was not as extreme. Weather normalization is just a way to adjust for those tweaks. However, we did not do that because for non-weather related emissions like transportation, let's say, it isn't as meaningful. So know that going into the methodology, the emissions are not weather normalized. On the methodology, the last thing I'll say is about scope, which you might have heard, scope 1, 2, and 3 for greenhouse gas emissions. What that basically means is that in-boundary greenhouse gas emissions that are direct to the community are the ones that we have calculated, which are on the left-hand side of your slide of your screen, kind of continuing on from the 2010 study. So in 2010, a lot of the scope 1 was calculated given the nature of Juneau more broadly. But there are other out of boundary emissions that occur, which are not part of this study. Some examples of that include any kind of indirect emissions, like all of the, let's say, furniture or clothes that you buy that might have been manufactured elsewhere. The biosolids that get shipped out to Oregon for waste. So that is not being counted because it's being counted by Oregon. Any kind of outside Juneau refueling of vessels or any kind of transportation, mostly marine, that fuel outside of Juneau. Those are scope 3 because those are not within the operational boundary of the community. For scope 1, what you will see throughout this presentation is the way we've categorized fuel combustion on stationary assets. Think of buildings, facilities, etc. Mining, industrial processes, and product use, in-boundary transportation, air, marine, and on-road transportation within the boundary, and then finally the power that is generated and sold to both the stationary buildings as well as powering electric needs of transportation. So scope 1 is what we will be concentrating more of. And since the generated power that comes from ALNP is within boundary, both of those things will be included, and scope 3 will not be included in the results that you'll see here in a bit. So the community energy, the collection of data really started across these major sectors. I'll start with transportation first, just because in the order of magnitude. Like I said, there's 3 major components to transportation. On-road transportation, we've estimated through vehicle miles traveled for the calendar year 2021, with data from the state of Alaska for the number of vehicles on the road and the type. For waterborne, we've looked at fuel data available from the ports, a state study, and traffic information from private data provider that looked at all vessel activity for the calendar year 2021. And for air transport, we looked at personnel within JIA, within the airport, gave us data for aviation gasoline and jet fuel by major airlines and also some smaller airlines. So that's our energy consumption attributed to transportation for the calendar year of 2021. For buildings, we looked at stationary combustion across various fuel types, obviously electricity, propane, wood, and fuel oil. And for purchased electricity, we had data provided by sector, megawatt hours for the 2021 calendar year from ALNP, as well as what was generated hydro versus diesel to generate each kilowatt hour of power for 2021. Industrial processes came from the EPA. Both Greens Creek Mine and the Kensington Mine provided data for the 2021 calendar year to the US EPA through the flights database, as well as capital disposal landfill also provided data for both CO2 and methane for landfill activities within the area for 2021. So all of these sectors are akin to what was already classified in 2010. So it gives us some level of comparability, and both the energy types and sectoral breakdowns have been aligned so we can have that 11-year comparability for the study that we're presenting here today. So without much further ado, the data for 2021 shows that community-wide energy consumption has been around 5 million British thermal units, which is a unit of energy. You can use that energy to go from gallons of fuel all the way to kilowatt hours of electricity. So it's an all-encompassing energy type. You can see both the sectoral breakdown for this number, as well as the fuel type breakdown of this number. So this gives you a sort of a broad view of which sectors or which entities are highest energy consumers, and also what type of energy specifically is being consumed in the community. You'll see buildings consume 44% of all energy in Juneau, or did in 2021, and 41% of all of that energy goes to transportation. The two mines account for the remaining 15% or so. Over on the energy type side, you'll see majority of the emission is liquid fuels, from diesel to heating oil to motor gasoline and fuel diesel, as well as aviation gasoline and jet fuel. So liquid fuels are the majority fuel type that was consumed by these sectors in 2021. So that gives you a kind of a broad idea of what the 2021 inventory found as it relates to energy specifically. Which is interesting because despite a slight population growth, a 1.8% growth between the population of Juneau in 2010 to 2021, we see a significant reduction of energy, 23% reduction from what was reported in 2010. So from 4.8 million MMBTU to 6.3 million MMBTU back in 2010. And I'll go through the emissions number here in a second. Emissions also had a similar reduction, almost 29% reduction from 397,000 metric tons of CO2e back in 2010 to 281,000 metric ton of CO2e in 2021 community-wide estimates. You can see that trend here for energy. You'll see that a lot of the sectoral breakdowns are the same that were in 2010 as they are in 2021. So you can see these trend lines as comparability. So the mines, the two mines, buildings, transportation, you can see where exactly the relative changes came from compared from 2021 compared to the ones we had in 2010. So beyond this sectoral view, you can also have a source view where you're going from the different types of fuels that were burned or that were consumed in 2010 to the ones that were consumed in 2021 in the updated study. So that was energy, which is in British thermal units. Now we're on to CO2e, which is the community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. So you'll see in terms of the sectoral breakdown, you can see transportation accounted for half the emissions in 2021. And you can see a further breakdown of the 50% broken down by marine, highway, and air. And then the other half was shared by buildings, 26%, the 2 mines, and the landfill. So this is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in 2021, broken down by major sector, and transportation broken down by the subsector. If you recall, in the energy slide, you saw the breakdowns of different energy consumption, but here's the contributions of different fuel types to the overall community-wide emissions. Majority of the emissions are still due to the type of liquid fuel that's being consumed. So marine and on-road using diesel and gasoline, heating oil, diesel fuel, and aviation gasoline and jet fuel. Majority of the emissions for 2021 is still driven mostly by liquid fuels. And then electricity, which is a pretty big component, is mostly hydroelectric. So the contribution of electricity has been negligible, given there's been great changes in the type of renewable energy that is powering Juneau, quite literally, from 2010 to 2021. So transportation is still, the highlight here is 50% comes from transportation. A pretty big portion comes from buildings, which is 26%. And then in terms of fuels, these are the liquid fuels that's responsible for those relative contributions to the 2021 greenhouse gas emissions. And similar to the energy trends, you can also do the same in terms of metric tonnage. You can see what sectors were responsible for the emissions back in 2010, and to what extent have they changed in the 2021 updated inventory. And then finally, you do the same trend between the fuel type being burned back in 2010 to the one that we have in 2021. A few details, in some of the first slides we mentioned that while in 2010 there was actual fuel usage available for a lot of the liquid fuels, in 2021 we didn't have ability to get access to the calendarized fuel data. So we estimated a lot of that from different activity metrics that we generally use in other sort of contexts. And we added the nuance for Juneau and this estimation strategy. So I'll touch a little bit on the different types of transportation emission methodology that we've used to estimate the liquid fuel. So as you know, on-road transportation emissions are emissions that happen when you consume diesel or gasoline in vehicles. In the past, this number was provided by the fuel providers, and because it was unavailable in 2021, we used vehicle miles traveled estimates in 2021 from the Alaska Department of Transportation and Public Facilities. And I'll maybe show some of that here in a little bit. But basically, in 2021, there was a database that looked at the average annual daily traffic for Juneau and other places within Alaska, and we converted it using DOT methodologies to vehicle miles traveled, from which we went back to the GPC greenhouse gas emissions inventory to look at what is the ton per miles traveled by major vehicle classes. The vehicle class data we also got for 2021 from basically DMV, which looks at per zip code what types of vehicles are registered for that calendar year, and the data classifications were light vehicles, mostly passenger vehicles, and some light vehicles, medium and heavy vehicles, and motorcycles. So we use those vehicle classification codes to go back to the vehicle miles traveled to ascribe the average miles per gallon for those vehicle classes to get to the gallons that they would have used if they traveled those miles for the 2021 calendar year. So the results generated 152 million miles of travel by these vehicle classes. And going back to the GPC, we estimated the greenhouse gas emissions, assuming the light and medium use motor gasoline and the heavy uses diesel, which is an assumption that was in line with what 2010 methodology had made. So that's on-road transportation. And then we actually got actuals for the aviation consumption. So we collected data from FAA on enplanements, which is a metric that a lot of modelers use to figure out greenhouse gas emissions from flights. But we actually also had further data from Juneau International Airport on the number of passengers that enplaned, the tons of mail and freight that went on, as well as the actual aviation gasoline and jet fuel consumption in gallons for the 2021 calendar year. And the total gallons of liquid fuels used in aviation was almost 4 million gallons, which was a 0.4% reduction from 2010. So the numbers are fairly sort of stable when it comes to the transportation emissions from aviations, at least gallon per gallon. And finally, marine. Marine transportation emissions, just to be clear, is for all marine activity within the operational boundary of Juneau. And typically, if you look at 2010, it's all of the gasoline and diesel that was sold by the major fuel distributors within Juneau. So again, because this was not available to us for the 2021 update, we went to vessel information from a few private providers, mostly marinetraffic.com, that records all vessels that come in and out of ports, their total weight in terms of the cargo weight, the total number of passengers, size of vessel, and the nautical miles that were logged before and after the port. So from that data, we were able to estimate the fuel usage for those types of vessels. And since we had the timeline from January 1st of 2021 to December 31st, 2021, we analyzed it for the calendar year, which was the horizon through which we were doing this study. We also got specific data. We were able to break down a little bit more between cargo and passenger. A large portion of marine emissions did come from cruise ships. In 2017, the state did a study, and it was 84% of all diesel-based emissions for marine was attributed to cruise ships. In 2021, we were able to estimate that in ton for ton, 91% of all cargo coming in and out of Juneau was cruise ships, and 26% of all miles traveled across all vessels, tugboats, etc., was cruise ships. And based on these patterns, we were able to estimate that 82% of the total marine emissions, which actually accounts to 14% of the community emissions, could then be attributed to large passenger ships like cruise ships for the 2021 study. We had the port call records. We have a list of arrivals and departures for the calendar year for the port. And we also recorded the dead weight, which is the maximum weight of cargo in tons across all of the vessel types. So we know exactly which vessel, what percentage of the vessels were heavy versus which were light. A lot of this data actually comes from the AIS systems for a lot of the vessels. The private provider, when they don't have data, they do go to other providers to backfill that data. So we believe this is the most accurate data that's tracked by multiple third parties, logistic companies, fulfillment centers, and also the public sector. So we felt that this was the most closest proxy for the 2021 year that represented vessels across major types. So we have a pretty good understanding of the marine activity that we could attribute to the marine emissions. So that was some of our methodologies that we used to backfill data for direct, fuel inputs that we would have had or what we had back in 2010, but because it was unavailable, these are some of the measures we administered for the 21 year. We also just to make sure, beyond the vessel data, we had some secondary data compared to. We worked with the Port of Juneau to look at gallons sold across the different locations in 2021 itself. So we did come to 3.45 million gallons, estimated gallons that were sold, but there were some data gaps. We wanted to make sure we can still have the vessel information corroborate this. And then there was an actual study done by the state in 2017 that estimated 5.2 million gallons of different types of fuel use across all vessel types. So we feel that the range is anywhere from 3.4 million to 5.2 million, and we came up with 4.8 million using a completely independent activity-based model. So that gives you an idea of the sensitivity, the confidence interval that we have in estimating some of these strategies. But at the end of the day, if we have actuals, that's the gold standard, right? So that's what, you know, if anyone has that data, we'd love to have it. So that was marine, on-road, and air transportation. I want to take a little bit to talk about the industrial process and waste emissions. These are the three entities, if you will, or three locations that contribute in the order that they appear. The Kensington mine, they provided data to the EPA for 2021. From the mine itself, almost 47,000 metric tons of emissions were emitted, which actually is a 2.5-time increase from where they were in 2010. They were at 18,000 or so metric tons in 2010, which increased to almost 47,000 in 2021. And the reason for that, according to the EPA, is the use of fuel oil, as well as LPG, liquefied petroleum gasoline, that the mine used for various stationary and process activities. Next, we have the capital disposal landfill, which is the waste in boundary waste disposal facility, and that emitted almost 13,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2021, and that was a reduction from the 27,000 that we saw back in 2010. Again, according to the EPA, this number is based on the diesel usage and the used oil usage within the facilities, as well as the methane that was given off from the decomposition of organic and inorganic materials within the landfill for the 2021 calendar year. And then finally, the Greens Creek mine also supplied data to the EPA for 2021. They were at 6,603 metric tons of emissions, which is a 67% reduction from the 20,000 or so metric tonnage that they emitted back in 2010. In 2021, it was mostly due to the consumption of fuel oil and propane and a little bit of used oil. So these three are the industrial emissions that were given up within the boundary in 2021, 2 mines and 1 landfill facility. Power sector, we looked at actual data from ALNP on what was generated in terms of electricity. Mostly came from diesel and hydrogen, hydroelectric power. Overwhelmingly hydroelectric, 99.86% of the total generation in 2021 was hydro, 0.14 was diesel. We also know the different meters that were used, or the load side of the equation where the power was delivered, commercial, government, residential, and transportation. So that gives you a picture of where the electrons came from and where they went. That helps us understand the emissions that I was discussing about scope 2, which is about power generation, and that has decreased in terms of emissions by 6%, but electricity overall has increased 9% since 2010 to 2021, which isn't surprising because broadly across the nation there has been a lot more electrification happening from back in 2010 to 2021. But the good news is, despite this increase in the kilowatt hours that were consumed, the emissions of those consumptions went down. So the trend is definitely going to a lower carbon direction, at least comparing those 2 years. So real quick, so one of the things that we learned for this year is that both, or in 2021, both the energy consumption in BTUs as well as the metric tonnage in greenhouse gas emissions have reduced from these preliminary findings since the 2010 greenhouse gas inventory. But at the same time, you know, we are, as Denise said, comparing 2 non-consecutive years. So there's a lot of things that could have happened in this 11-year period between 2010 and 2021, which we cannot necessarily attribute to somewhat of a trend, or we can't really say definitively that there's causality between what happened throughout these years. These are just two distinct years that we're comparing. So take that with a little bit of a caveat there. And also, it's important to identify that there are variables that are at play that could impact greenhouse gas emissions across two non-consecutive years. I know we didn't do 2020 because of the impacts of COVID, but we did do 2021 where it was more realistic to compare those 2 years. But there might be other factors that we have to keep in mind while comparing these two studies. And the model, of course, is impacted by the availability of data as well as the accuracy of data. So if we had more data available for fuels, if the other more direct data available, obviously our model performs better than it would if we are backfilling a lot of missing pieces. Luckily, there's only two major items that we have to backfill on the liquid fuel side. And kind of voicing 2010's report takeaways where they said, the inventories need to be conducted more frequently to figure out what's working and what's not, or which sectors are performing or trending upwards or downwards. The 2021 inventory voices those same recommendations to make sure we're completely aware of some of the inputs that impact what the emissions are from a given community year over year, so we can better sort of understand trends. We can better look across sectors, across fuel types to really get a good handle of where our emissions are coming from. With that, I'll stop here. And Denise, should we open this up for discussion?
Sure. So as I had promised, I know that you can't give the presentation and check in the chat, but I think one of the questions is really about, let's start with a question about comparability. Essentially, I'm trying to search for the question, but it's essentially, are the methods used in 2010 and the methodology used for 2021, does that really enable a valid comparison between the two?
Yeah, so there's two pieces to that answer. One is around the methodology itself, like assuming we have the right energy, are we attributing it to the right emissions? For that, it's absolutely, we're using the GPC protocol, so there should not be any differences in the way we estimate the greenhouse gas component of that. The secondary piece, which is perhaps more challenging, is the fuel distributor provided data, which is actual sales data within the community versus what we were estimating based on the activity within the community. I think that's the caveat that we're providing here in this slide, is that because we didn't have that data, we had to resort to modeling. So that is a caveat. But if we did have that data, even sort of retroactively from some of the members of the community, then we don't have that secondary piece of that question. It's the same thing. Whatever was delivered in terms of data for fuel in 2010, if we had the same comparable data, you can make a pretty good sort of apples to apples comparison between 2010 and 2021.
Okay, and Maria just clarified that she was asking if we could do a comparison with 2007. I'm guessing that's something that we could do, but in terms of this presentation, and maybe that's something we could do in the report, but for the presentation, we thought it might be too confusing to have, there's already a lot of information, but to have 3 points in time, 2007, 2010, and 2021. But that is maybe something we could put into the report. And let's see, I think I'm just trying to find questions that are of a similar vein, trying to group them a little bit. I think we've got that. Oh, maybe Sunny, can you go back to the slide where I think there was some dialogue about, wanting to see what the comparison, sort of the punchline, the comparison was between 2010 and 2021.
In terms of emissions or energy?
In terms of emissions, and we have, and if you could maybe show both some of those slides, but there's also a slide with the narrative that talks about what the reduction was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So this is a slide kind of because contextualizing the economic activity arguably has gone up by 1.8% because there's more people within Juneau in 2021 than there were in 2010. It's not substantive, but here's the numbers that show what percentage reduction in the 2021 energy compared to the 2010 energy, as well as the 2021 emissions versus the 2010 emissions.
Great, thank you. So then moving on to other types of questions. There was an initial question, why were aviation fuels so much less in 2021? You have a slide that does that comparison in aviation fuels. Could you maybe go to that slide?
You mean the change in energy for aviation fuel?
For aviation, yes. And I thought you also had a narrative slide where it showed that it was, I think, actually pretty similar, I think 0.4%.
Yeah, so that one is right here. Yeah, so between so again, looking at the emissions for air, the 3.9 million gallons is what was consumed by the aviation line item, which was a 0.4% reduction from 2010. So it's negligible. It's stayed fairly same, although you don't want to take into effect that 2021, I think we get asked that all the time, is that what was the flight activity a year into COVID? So take that with that context, but that 4 million gallons of fuels is what was consumed by air in 2021.
All right, great, thank you. The next question was on slide 11, pie chart on the right shows a yellow wedge for diesel fuel. How is that different from the diesel incorporated marine and on-road wedge in blue?
Are you talking about this slide, the emission
I
slide?
think so.
Yeah, so heating oil is just the way it's so marine and on-road, it's the same. Motor gasoline and transportation diesel, it's the same as this one. The emission factors and everything else is the same as this one. Aviation gasoline and jet fuel are derivative petroleum products, but we have different emission factors. And then heating oil, it's fuel number 2, which is very similar to diesel, but is actually classified separately in the GHG protocol. So we use the same categories as 2010 so that people could know that this diesel fuel for stationary isn't being commingled with the diesel that you use in a heavy duty vehicle.
And then maybe also along, once again, trying to sort of bundle similar questions. A question about building energy. Building energy averages 2/3 heat and 1/3 electric. While the data shows buildings as a major energy user, the energy source pie chart shows heating oil as a disproportionately much smaller component of overall energy use. So I guess it's maybe more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, so maybe that's something we can talk slightly about. So again, the fuel distributors, we don't have actual numbers for actual fuel. So what we're using is the ACS survey from 2020 to look at the major heating fuel by building type within Juneau. So here's the percentages of different fuel types that people are using to heat according to the American Community Survey from the US Census. So that's what we use to figure out what is the greenhouse gas emissions contribution, knowing we have 13,000 homes. Each home, according to the according to NREL, says this is the energy use intensity of a single family home, multi-family home, and we are using those estimates to come at the heating oil totals. So that is again a model, because we don't have, it's a same common thread. It's estimated based on ACS 2020 numbers.
Yeah, and then a couple of comments that really talk about essentially tourism in 2021, and question whether we were completely rebounded to whatever is going to be normal. And those are great questions, and I think that to address that is the issue of our ability to contractually do this again for several years, and then we can get a better trend and see how 2021 compares to 2022 and 2023. But that's a good point. And then the next one, I think moving to marine transportation emissions. So a question, just to confirm, marine fuel usage and greenhouse gas emissions represent activity within the boundaries of the CBJ, correct?
Yes, so if you go back to, again, not to be dense, but like, the protocol is almost very prescriptive about what is and isn't scope 1 marine transportation. So anything that happens within the boundary, there's two different things that can happen. One is actual fuel consumption, any fuel that is put inside a vessel within the boundary versus miles traveled within the boundary, but they never fueled, right? So in that case, you can have vessels coming in from outside that just refueled, came to Juneau and left. That gets caught in our vessel traffic information, but on the actual fuel within the ports and harbors within Juneau, we capture only the fuel that went into vessels within Juneau. So there's two ways of looking at it. We are not counting any fuel that was put in outside of Juneau. We are only calculating based on our boundary and based on the recommendations from the GPC on what should be counted for Juneau. In the same way, anything that happens, even flights that go over or anything that isn't being served within the boundary, we would not count because that is not for Juneau to count. In other words, if it goes somewhere after Juneau or it is coming from somewhere before Juneau, you're double counting that emissions to both communities. So we don't want to double count. We would only ascribe the single one to that boundary and then ignore everything else.
Okay, then some new chat back to the aviation fuel topic. Aviation fuels less than 2021, no helicopter tourist flights that summer. And then a follow-up comment of good point. I was going to ask why the bar graph showed a significant decrease in avgas/jet fuel, while the text slide stated that liquid aviation fuel transportation only dropped 0.4%. Is that discrepancy because of the helicopters weren't counted as transportation?
So I'm not sure. So I can go back to the data from the airports. I am not sure where helicopters are counted, but the 0.4 is the reduction of emissions from across aviation, not specifically aviation gasoline, or we're combining it and then making it into emissions. So we can definitely check on the breakdowns, but this is a total for 21, 3.9 million gallons of both fuels combined, not broken down by helicopter versus small airplane versus large airplane. So we can add a little bit blown up narrative to this piece if that's helpful.
All right, and then last question for now. Why couldn't the building's energy consumption be weather normalized between 2010 and 2021 heating degree days? So this is back to the weather normalization concept.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, and we can definitely do something like that. But remember that the communities, 60% of the community's emissions are from non-buildings. So even normalizing for weather, you'd be explaining less than half of the emissions and their sensitivity to weather, and it's just hard to then compare within inventory. What does that really mean, right? So we can definitely do that for buildings, but that's going to be kind of a piece to that sector only. That sector, the building sector comparison won't be meaningful to comparing it with growth in the other sectors. Like transportation has nothing to do with weather normalization, and normalizing one sector and not the other, then you don't really know what that 280,000 metric tons mean. So we can add a weather normalization discussion, but likely, most emissions are not weather normalized because of that reason.
I think that we may have gotten to most of the questions. So while I'm still scrolling, maybe this would be a good opportunity for you, Sunny, to show a draft of the map that you're working on, the interactive tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a company, like what we have always been very intentional about is the actionability of these numbers. So while we were happy to kind of provide a snapshot point in time, what we've seen be very impactful is like a dynamic view of that. Like what happened, what is my total emissions within my community? Could I do something myself? Like if you're a building owner somewhere, could you just pull up your home and see where your emissions come from and what you could do about it? We've seen stuff like that being very engaging to community members. So they're not just looking at a number for the community, which is important, but have some levers available to them depending on who they are. So we've had community groups that have helped entire communities look at heat pump or on rooftop solar opportunities. We've had cities look at sort of incentive programs, utilities look at rebate programs. So we are going to be launching this map, which takes the community numbers that you saw and makes it dynamic with a Juneau map. So you can do some basic what if scenarios of what happens if power is 100% hydro. What happens if I were to electrify all heating oils? You can run different scenarios at different levels, be it at your home or like office or the entire community. So you can have more intuitive understanding of what we're ultimately going to put on the report that you see on March 1st. So that's still in the works. It'll be launched for the community, and we're sort of very excited to help make this a little bit more dynamic than traditionally people have looked at emissions. So,
and I would just add, in terms of the timing, we're not going to launch this until we finalize the report, essentially, because it's part of, as I had mentioned earlier, this iterative process where we're sharing the preliminary results. We wanted to, we know we have a lot of expertise in the community. We want to get community feedback at this juncture at this meeting, and then also at the March 1st meeting, there'll be a draft report and a public comment period. And then once we have that opportunity to receive all that valuable feedback, and then we feel confident that we've got the right information, then we would call it final for 2021. And those numbers would be reflected in that interactive tool. And all of those materials will be available publicly. But I think so far this is a good news story in terms of the 2021 to 2010. There's lower emissions, so that's, I think, something nice and good to see. Trying to see if there are any more comments in the chat. I don't see any more comments, so maybe I'll hand this over to Gretchen. I don't know if you have some comments you want to make, or you thought maybe you'd poll the JCOS members and give them an opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you, Sunny, for your presentation. At this point, I think that would be a good opportunity if any JCOS members would like to offer comments. I guess I'll start with one, and Denise kind of mentioned this. The origin of this effort to capture a more current energy profile for the community was a memo that JCOS, the Commission on Sustainability, sent to the Assembly in December 2020. So little over 2 years. I think that's pretty good response, and kudos to the Assembly for funding the study in the next budget cycle, and Denise and also other staff at CBJ who have provided yeoman work in putting together the data. Steve.
Yeah, I just like to say thanks, Denise, for your overview, and Sunny for the materials. speaking on behalf of the JCOS Energy Committee, I think, this gives a really helpful big picture for the community. And it also points to some pretty interesting questions about why some of these differences occurred. And it also points to the fact that, as Sonny pointed out in his last slide, this really gives us some tools to dig into this stuff in more detailed fashion. And I think that definitely there's going to be some more questions about buildings, for example, and I think we're going to want to dig into understanding the assumptions that go into the building energy use and how that relates to other kinds of information, particularly for those of us who are also working on promoting heat pumps and trying to push heat pumps. I can see using some of these tools to help us with that project. So I see it as being a great step, and look forward to working on answering some of these questions that people are asking about the details.
Thanks, Steve. Any other comments from JCOS members? I don't see any. I do see Kent from Sitka with a question. Go ahead, Kent.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me this question. I was wondering, in that last bit of Sonny's presentation with the dynamic kind of a modeling capability, as Juneau is successful or just modeling electrification of building, heat, and transportation, is that model going to assume the same 99% hydroelectric source, so we'll be able to grow indefinitely at that set level of renewable energy, or does the model going to reflect the fact that well, only so much renewable energy is currently available for electrification, and at some point that's going to trigger the need to invest in more? If that
Yeah, no, if I may answer, yeah, so that's a really good question. Something with Constellation, we own a lot of generation that we dispatch. So the beauty of the GHG protocol is that every year we do get supplier specific data that shows what happened that year. So if load increases, if you have double the need for electricity and you're turning on peaker plants, that would get caught in successive inventories. We would hear that, hey, we had to do double more diesel generators. We had to bring in diesel because everyone, got on electric. So that those things do get caught. We don't assume that. We definitely don't project it out. When that calendar year comes live, we would be asking for what generation what was combusted for that electricity for that year. That's a great question. Okay, thanks.
I don't see any other hands raised. Let me double check.
One more comment just came in. If JCOS or Dynamics hasn't yet approached Alaska Housing Finance Corporation for residential and public building energy use, the agency has significant data illustrating the heating electric energy use breakdown for what Jim Rayfeld mentioned.
That's great to know. We will definitely take you up on that offer and see if we can include that context in the report. Is that something we already got, Denise, you think? Because I did get some data.
I don't think so. We had talked to Alaska, well, for Steve, who is our representative for both JCOS and Alaska Heat Smart. We had asked him if he had any data relative to heat pumps, but we didn't talk to Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. So that's a data source that we could look at. So thanks for that.
Steve?
That's correct. The Alaska Heat Smart has looked at some of some of the data that that Tim Leach mentioned, but I don't believe that it was incorporated into the into this modeling effort. And I think that's one of the kinds of things we would want to look at in the next phase of getting more specific about the buildings sector.
Okay, anyone else have a comment or a question? Sonny, you answered them all. So again,
Yeah.
as Denise mentioned, and Denise, you can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that March 1, JCOS has its regular monthly meeting, and we anticipate having the draft report. And I don't know if Denise, you're anticipating that Sunny would make a presentation on that, or at least be available for questions.
Sunny is aware of that. We've talked about, he is planning on attending that March 1st meeting.
Okay. So anyone following this, you're certainly welcome to plug into it. It will also be a Zoom meeting. And then at that point, the city's looking at a public review comment period on the order, I guess, of a couple weeks. And certainly look forward to any comments people might have at that point. And Denise, Sunny, do you have a sort of game plan in terms of when the final report might be available?
I think that always depends on the number and the extent of the comments that you receive.
Right.
So I think it's hard to, we'll of course, try and keep this momentum going. But I'm a little hesitant to commit to a firm date until we see the nature and extent of comments.
Okay, so that's fair enough. I know that the commission is itself is interested in using this report and its information as part of a informational session, what we call committee of the whole meetings with the assembly sometime this spring, hopefully. So stay tuned for that if we can pull it together. And I think at this point, we will close that portion of our agenda. And I'll look for my agenda. Do commissioners have any information items they would care to share? I made a comment to Steve. There's kind of a fire hose of grant programs being launched by various federal agencies. And I mentioned one to him this morning that, and a lot of them are requests for information from people in the field. And there was one that came out of DOE that I think we can pass on. It had to do with offshore wind power, which I haven't heard anyone proposing turbines in Gastineau Channel or Favorite Strait. So, but any other comments? Do commissioners have any comments, or our liaison, Maria, any information you want to pass off to the commission?
Thank you for the opportunity. I don't think so. The only thing I'd say about this whole thing is it would be most helpful to the assembly, I think, to know comparisons by sector if it can be done. Again, you had 3 different ones and there's 3 different methodologies. I don't know which one, are valid to compare with which one, but the more you can, the better. So we know, it went up or down and, some supposition about why. Just the number, how many tons is, of course, not understandable. So that'd be great to hear. Thank you.
Okay, good comment.
Gretchen,
Okay,
Gretchen, I guess I would just pass along that there's going to be another opportunity to review the marine passenger fee requests. That was just something that was decided at the Public Works Committee on Monday. And I'm blanking out the deadline for it. I think
March 8th.
March 8th. So that's something that the commission might want to go back and focus on, particularly given that there's been quite a bit of clarification about some of the aspects of dock electrification and some actions the assembly's taken and some other actions that we'd like to see clarified, at least information clarified about a plan for dock electrification. So we'll be keeping in touch about that.
Yeah, at that Public Works and Facilities, Assembly Public Works and Facilities Committee meeting on this past Monday, Chair Bryson was talking about a kind of an in-depth meeting in the front of the committee. I think it was on solid waste, but there was some also some talk about, as Steve alluded to, getting some clarity on what the game plan is in terms of electrification of the dock. Oh, it was Alec Pierce suggested that trying to have a session or some clarification, just what the bigger picture is in terms of dock electrification. So that I don't think that wouldn't be a JCOS initiated effort. It would pretty much, I believe, come from the Assembly Public Works and Facilities Committee, is my sense. Denise, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you are right that session that the Chair Bryson of the Public Works and Facilities Committee is talking about is a session that will likely happen in April, and that's about solid waste. So that won't be about the dock electrification issue. Those are separate issues. But I had raised my hand because I was going to just add something different, some other information. Just wanted to acknowledge Diana for having just submitted 2 grants. For all the talk that we always have about grants and chasing federal money. Diana, a week after she started this job, which was the week after she had only lived in Juneau for like a week. And I handed her 2 big grant applications, and one is for compost, and that's in addition to, we've talked about that in previous meetings, but we have new people here, but that is a $4 million grant that is in addition to the $2.5 million congressionally directed spending that we were fortunate enough to get from Senator Murkowski. And the second grant is a smaller grant, more in the hundreds of thousands, and that's for a source control issue that we have that is an issue with our wastewater treatment plant. And we've had Brian McGuire, the utility superintendent, give a presentation in the past to this group about source control. If anybody was interested in that, I can resend that. But that's what that second grant is about. So I wanted to acknowledge she got them in yesterday and the deadline is today. So well done.
All right, thank you, Diana. Lori, I see a hand.
Yeah, I just want to make one quick comment in reference to the data that's been shared today. The 2010 data for the split between generation between diesel and hydro. I want to go back and see, what data was used in 2010 and compare it, because the quick calculation that I have is that it was actually 0.1% diesel and not 1% diesel production at that time. So just a note that I want to go back through and carefully make sure that I'm giving you the right numbers. But we look forward to, reviewing that data and make sure that all the accurate data is out there in this report.
Wonderful.
All
Do you
right,
mean for
thank you.
21 or 2010?
2010.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I think we're ready to wrap this, which is very unusual for JCOS that we're actually ending before 1:30. Laura, your hand's still up. You're done, right? Oh, okay. So our next meeting is again March 1st. Again, it will be 12 p.m. same time, same vehicle, Zoom. So on that note, I'd like to again shout out to Sunny for his work and his presentation to us. There's a lot of us in the community and clearly some folks farther afield in other Alaskan communities that are very interested in your work. And on that note, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.